long run for perfectly competitive markets. So if a firm is earning a profit, and we see this here on the right, initially we have the market here, initially supply and demand cross right here at $3. For the firm, they're going to face that horizontal demand curve at $3, whatever the market price is. So where that demand curve, the price, marginal revenue, they're all going to be the same. That horizontal line is going to be all three of those. Where the marginal revenue curve crosses marginal cost curve, that's what they're going to produce. You see them here, the difference between the price of where they're producing and the average total cost is going to be their profit. We got this nice greenish, brownish, yellowish area of profit. When there's profit, economic profit in a perfectly competitive market, other firms are going to enter the market and begin competing. They see this opportunity to earn a profit above and beyond what they can do in some other industries. So they're going to begin competing. As more firms enter the market, remember that's going to shift our supply curve to the right, increase our supply. So for the market overall, it's going to move the price down in equilibrium. So in this case, from $3 to $2. And it's going to push it all the way down to where the marginal cost, the marginal revenue, where they're going to choose to produce, the individual firm, is equal to the average total cost. So we've gotten rid of all profit in this industry. And remember, we're looking at economic profit here, not accounting profit. So these firms can still be earning a nice profit on their balance sheet, but we're also taking into account opportunity cost. So the other lines of businesses, the other products, the other industries that these firms could be in. Now, if firms are earning a loss in the short run, we can see the same basic thing happen, only from the opposite. So initially, have the demand curve here and supply curve here in equilibrium. And we have the firm here, their demand curve, marginal revenue curve, equals the price at $2. We got this backwards again. Okay. Well, I don't have enough time to go into Paint and do this over again. I'm not going to ask you a question about this on the final because this is messed up. So basically what's going to happen is initially, equilibrium price is down here. It's below the average total cost. I think that's the second time you guys did that in unison.
Is that the same view?
So basically, when there's firms earning an economic loss in this industry, some firms are going to choose to stay in, some are going to choose to leave and go into a different industry. They'll make more money somewhere else. What that's going to do is reduce the supply. I don't even know why they have demand changing here. That's going to reduce the supply as firms leave the market. What that'll do is drive up the price. And this will drive up the price all the way up until it reaches, in this case, $2. At $2, there's zero economic profit. So when there's a profit opportunity, when firms are earning an economic profit, you will see new firms starting, and they will join that industry, begin competing. As we increase the supply, that's going to decrease the equilibrium price. So firms will make less and less economic profit until they've reached the minimum of their average total cost curve. At that point, there's no incentive for more firms to begin entering the industry and competing because they can't earn an economic profit. On the other hand, when firms are earning a loss in the short run, some firms are going to exit the industry. They'll go somewhere else where they can make a profit. That's going to decrease the supply and push up the price. And it's going to push up the price until we reach the average firm's average total cost curve. So instead of down like this shows, we're moving up to the average total cost there. Once we reach there, there's no profit for any firms. So there's no incentive for firms to leave the industry at that point. Whatever. Okay. So basically, what those two slides show us is how long-run competitive equilibrium is reached in these perfectly competitive markets. So initially, we just looked at one firm whether they're making money or losing money in an economic sense. So again, considering opportunity costs as well as the explicit costs and explicit revenues they're laying out. If firms are making an economic profit, additional firms are going to begin entering the market, and they're going to drive down the price to this break-even level. No firm will be earning an economic profit, but no firm in the industry will be earning an economic loss. Because there's no chance to earn a profit, as if additional firms would enter, they would start earning a loss because they'd be pushing, they'd be increasing the price, so pushing the supply down by a little bit. On the other hand, if firms are making an economic loss, some firms are going to exit the market. So they're going to drive the price back up to the break-even level. And again, once they reach that break-even level and firms are not earning a profit or a loss, they're just breaking even, there's no further incentive for more firms to leave the industry. So in our perfectly competitive markets, our long-run competitive equilibrium is where the entry and exit of firms, which can happen continuously, results in the typical firm breaking even. That's the extent, that's the end of competition in this perfectly competitive market. That's what we're moving towards. So when we're looking at the long run, so when we have firms entering and exiting the market, shifting the supply curves for the market overall, the market is going to end up supplying demand by consumers at a price equal to the typical firm's average cost curve. So looking at this picture here, or the figure on the right, the average firm's, the typical firm's average total cost curve, that minimum point where it crosses the marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve, where there's zero economic profit, that's where we're going to be in this competitive market equilibrium. I'm not going to have you answer a question about this on the exam, but it's something I want to cover so you can understand how equilibrium works in a perfectly competitive market. You can think of the long-run supply curve as being horizontal at this price. So basically, what this means is that the long-run price is determined by supply. Because demand is horizontal, consumers are going to, for each typical firm, it's horizontal, so no matter how much a firm produces, consumers are going to be willing to buy at that market price. We end up with supply being the determinant of equilibrium in this market. Anytime demand is going to change, if it shifts to the right or shifts to the left for the market overall, so for wheat, more consumers want to buy wheat, they want to eat more bread, or maybe, I don't know, everyone in the country decides they want to start losing weight, they want to eat less bread. No matter what happens to the demand curve, the number of suppliers are going to adjust to provide that demand at the lowest possible price. They're going to meet whatever consumers demand at that price because there's economic profit to be made. So this looks confusing because there's a lot of curves going on here. So initially here, looking at this panel on the left, we have supply curve 1 and demand curve 1 here, so our initial equilibrium right there. So our long-run supply curve is going to be horizontal at that equilibrium price, actually. Let's say there's an increase in demand from D1 to D2. More people want to start eating bread, so there's now more wheat that are higher demand for wheat. What's going to happen? Of course, that pushes up the price to where the demand curve crosses the new supply curve. At this higher price, firms are now earning an economic profit in this perfectly competitive market. So what we're going to see is more firms enter the market, competing away this economic profit, shifting the supply curve all the way out here until we got back down to the long-run supply curve, back to the initial price at $2. So now we have more of the product being supplied to the market. We're shifting out, moving from Q1 to Q2 as we move from this initial equilibrium point to this equilibrium point. So there's more of the product being placed on the market, but it's being sold at the same price. Initially, there was no economic profit. All the firms were breaking even. When the demand curve first shifts, we end up with some economic profit, and that's going to encourage more firms to enter the market and encourage, greater production. So more of whatever product is going to be sold. And we see the reverse happening when there's a decrease in demand. So when there's a decrease in demand here, here's our initial equilibrium where the demand curve V1 crosses the supply curve S1 right here at the long run supply curve at $2. If demand decreases, people want to start eating healthier, so they're eating less bread. Shifting the demand curve to the left is going to reduce the price, so it drops from $2 to $1.75. Firms that were initially breaking even are now earning an economic loss. Some of them, so some farmers are going to decide, instead of growing wheat, I'll grow corn or something else that can actually make me a profit. As those farms begin to leave the industry, produce something else, they'll shift the supply curve to the left. That'll happen until we return to that initial $2. So in the long run, in a perfectly competitive market, if there is economic profit, that's going to be competed away by new firms entering. If there's an economic loss, that's going to dissipate as firms begin exiting the market and producing something else. Again, you're not going to have to draw these curves. And I know looking at like two demand curves and two supply curves at the same time can seem a little confusing. So it's not like I'm going to have you recreate that. But it's another way to, to visually show that we have more firms entering and exiting the market, that it's this supply that matters in a perfectly competitive market for determining what the equilibrium price and quantity is going to be. That brings us to the end of the chapter. There's a few things I do want to mention before we start the next one. Just the warning that all models abstract from reality. So we're working with this perfectly competitive model. And we have those, remember, those three assumptions. That there's low barriers to entry, that the goods are identical, and there's a lot of buyers and sellers. That's not going to hold for every market, obviously. In fact, perfectly competitive markets only explain a small number of industries, firms, and products that we can buy. It still has value though, so we're trying to understand the relationship between a few variables in certain situations. So while this isn't perfectly applicable to the real world, it still has some value to help us understand what's going on. We're about to talk about monopoly, and it's the same case. There's not a lot of actual monopolies in the world, but it's important to simplify, to look at this so we can understand what's going on when there is very limited competition. In this case, to understand what's going on when there's a lot of competition, a lot of firms. Models are a tool we use to understand the world. They're not a perfect representation. When you look at a map, I guess no one actually has like paper maps anymore, but if you look at like the map on your GPS, it's a lot smaller than the real world. It doesn't show a lot of the same details, like all the details are. If you wanted a perfect map that represented the real world, it would have to be life-sized. Obviously, it's not going to be useful for us. So we simplify it, we make it smaller, we get rid of a bunch of details, and it's useful. It's not perfect, but it's useful. It's the same thing with these models. That's the question here. Can you describe competition in the model of perfect competition? It's different than the competition we talked about way back in the beginning of the class. Instead of firms coming up with new products, new ideas that better meet consumer demand, what they end up doing is just producing more of a good. It's not really the competition that we think of. Instead of innovating, offering new products, or trying to do it in a cheaper way, it's just, hey, there's some profit made here, let's make the exact same good as everyone else. It implies that the existence of competition is evidence of some sort of inefficiency in the market, that there's some problem that's preventing us from this equilibrium, and so competition is annoying. We need to get to the end of this competition. Once we reach that perfectly competitive equilibrium, there's no more firms entering or exiting the industry. So now we're done. Now we've reached this perfectly efficient place. It's hard to justify this this model of competition when you're looking at the real world. Because we constantly see firms coming up with new products, coming up with cheaper ways to make products, things like that, to better meet consumer needs than they were able to in the past. Just completely gone when we're looking at perfect competition. Instead of just reducing prices to the minimum, there are a lot of other ways that firms compete with each other to try to get consumers to purchase their products, and ways to try to differentiate their products. Remember, we're assuming identical products in a perfectly competitive market, so we have that horizontal demand curve. Because if you try to raise your price at all, all your consumers are just going to buy from someone else, because you can get the same exact thing from someone else. But there's other ways you can try to, get some of your competitors' consumers, besides just lowering the price or increasing the quantity that you're putting out. You can improve the quality of your good. Subarus are super expensive because they're so reliable and they last for so long. A lot more expensive than the Chrysler I drive. They can use advertising to show maybe it's the quality of their product, or just to show the characteristics of their product, to show consumers how using this product can meet their needs. They can do something that I think is really interesting. They can tie other goods to that perfectly competitive good. So gasoline, for most people, is a perfectly competitive industry. People don't really care where they get their gasoline from, because there's no difference between buying it from one place or another. But if you can tie other goods to that, sell something else, then you can get people to purchase from you instead of others. You can get some sort of market power. So for instance, Sheetz has a lot of food. They have like the made to order where you can customize like all your food. They have like loyalty programs. So they're tying the purchase of this other stuff. You go there, you get gas, then you run in and you pick up like a Gatorade. You pick up some food to eat. So they're tying the gasoline to something else. And it makes people more willing to buy from Sheetz than getting gas somewhere else. And finally, brand name capital. So if you can establish a brand name, not just does it make it easier for consumers to remember, but if you can tie it to some way that is differentiated from other goods, then you can have some sort of market power. So we're moving out of a perfectly competitive market into a market where you're able to charge a higher price. So if every market was like a perfectly competitive market, all the products would be identical. This would not be a great situation for consumers. There's a lot of unmet needs that are going to exist if we all have the same exact product. People that need something slightly different won't be able to get the goods and services that they want. And it's because of this, because everyone has slightly different wants and different needs, that we end up with differentiation and the real kind of competition that we'll be talking about after the exam. So firms can improve their sales, they can earn a profit, they can make themselves better off and consumers better off by offering new goods that are slightly different, that meet new needs. Okay, this is basically a lot of the stuff I've been saying. Okay, and just remember what true entrepreneurship is. It's constant risk-taking. As an entrepreneur, you don't know if you're going to be successful or not. A lot of businesses fail within the first 2 years of opening. So there's a lot of risk involved with that. And what you're trying to do is offer a new product, do something to meet a consumer need that hasn't been met before. Entrepreneurs can offer incremental changes, so very small changes to existing products or different production techniques, or it could be revolutionary new ideas that have never been tried before. Either way, both of these are not present in a perfectly competitive market, or this ideal of a perfectly competitive market. Competition is a constant process. It's always going on. Firms are constantly engaged in research and development, or just trying to think of new ways to produce things. There's constant success and failures. So some entrepreneurs are right. Some firms that are just offering a new product, sometimes they're right. It turns out to be an incredibly good idea. Others copy them. Other times they offer a new product and it's bad. It doesn't meet consumer needs, and people don't want to buy it. There's no place for that in this model. There's no profit and loss serving as the filtering mechanisms for good and bad ideas. Again, like we talked about early on in class. Consumer tastes change over time. Entrepreneurs can discover how to meet needs that weren't met in the past. Again, this is what happens in the real world, not in a perfectly competitive market, in this idea. So the example of hard seltzer we talked about earlier, about White Claw coming out with this new product, and Truly, and then it becoming insanely popular, a lot of people buying it. They earn a really nice profit on that, and then all these other alcohol manufacturers begin selling hard seltzers and flooding the market with it. This isn't possible under perfect competition. A lot of times economists use perfect competition as the basis for comparing real world markets to. And if real world markets don't live up to that, they assume there's something wrong with it. But we can see there's a lot of good things that the perfectly competitive market model does not account for. All right, do you guys have any questions about perfect competition? On the study guide, I have a question show a perfectly competitive firm, like draw where the firm's earning an economic loss, and then show what happens to the market in the long run. Basically, like firms begin to leave, reduce the supply. I will change that for the exam to make it firms earning a profit, and ask you what happens because the slide was like messed up. I'm not going to make you answer a question that wasn't drawn properly in this slideshow. So we're going to go from one extreme to the other. We're going to go from perfect competition, where there's a ton of buyers and sellers, to a monopoly, where there's literally only one seller. There can be a small number of buyers or a large number of buyers. That really doesn't matter for a monopoly. When we're looking at monopoly, there's only one firm that's a seller of a good or service that doesn't have close substitutes. And while there's not a lot of examples where we'll be able to apply this, the basic idea of having market power is something we'll be using when we look at monopolistic competition. So it is still going to be useful to look at this. So some firms are going to be true monopolists. Again, they're rare, but there are some situations. And when there are these monopolies that exist in the real world, there are some different regulatory approaches that government uses to try to respond to them to make sure that consumers are protected and that they're receiving a high quality product. So it's important to understand how monopolies work so we can figure out what to do to improve those shortcomings of monopolies. And firms could also collude together to act like a monopolist. Very hard to do in the real world, but it is possible, where you have 4 or 5 firms in an industry. They all make an agreement together to sell at a certain price or at certain quantities, and they behave as if they're a monopolist. The best example of this is OPEC, the oil-producing countries, primarily in the Middle East. They all collude together to basically produce a certain quantity of crude oil, and so that they can earn a high enough price per barrel. So a lot of goods have substitutes. They may not be perfect substitutes. They may not be exactly the same. So a pizza shop, there may only be one pizza shop in town, but they may have competition still because there's someone else offering a different type of food. So you could think of hoagies as like an imperfect substitute for pizza. So for our definition of monopoly, think of it as a firm that does not have a competitor selling a close substitute. So we used to have a pizza shop in town called MVP. Now the new pizza shop opened up again. Could we consider it a monopoly because it's the only pizza shop in Loretto? Well, there's still Frankie's, LPG Tour, so there's, I guess, Spanky's too, that sell food. So you can get restaurant food somewhere else. There's other places like Smith Meyer's at Walmart that sell home-cooked pizzas. So there is some sort of substitutes. A frozen pizza from Smith Myers isn't the same as getting a pizza from MVP or whatever the pizza shop is now, but it's pretty close. So if you think a hoagie from the LPG or a frozen pizza from Smith Myers is a close enough alternative to a pizza from a pizzeria, then you could say that MVP, this pizza shop, is not a monopoly, that there's something else you can get to satisfy those needs. But maybe today you're really in the mood for high quality pizzeria pizza. If that's the case, then these probably won't be a good substitute. So you could think of MVP as a monopoly in this case. They're the only one that can provide the need and the want that you really have right now. Whether or not that pizza shop is a monopoly or not, they do have some sort of monopoly power or market power. So the perfectly competitive firm could not raise their prices at all because their competitors would just get all their business. People would buy the same exact good from somewhere else that was cheaper. In this case, MVP is the only one offering, good pizzeria pizza in town. So they can raise their prices some and obtain some economic profit. Of course, if they raise their prices, they're going to sell less. So there's that trade-off they have to think about. But they have some market power. They have the ability to set prices. Skip the example of NCAA, which takes up like a page or two in the textbook. So we'll look at just where do monopolies come from. So if a firm is going to exist as a monopoly, there has to be some sort of barrier to entry, something preventing other firms from easily entering the market and competing against them. Remember, in a perfectly competitive market, there were no barriers to entry. In a monopoly, there's very high barriers to entry. So it's going to be very difficult for someone else to compete against them. There's 4 main reasons for these barriers. We'll talk about each of them in a little bit more detail. But the first is government restrictions on entry. So the government says you're not legally allowed to compete against this entity. That gives them a lot of market power, and that gives them very high barriers to entry. They can also have control of a key resource. If they're the only one that's able to access, say, aluminum, they'll have a monopoly in the aluminum market. Another example is network externalities. So as more people use some products, it becomes more and more useful. If that's the case, they're going to have some monopoly power. And finally, there's a natural monopoly. That's a case where there's these high fixed costs, where if a firm produces more and more, and they reach that market demand, the costs are still going down. So for them, it's more efficient if you just have one producer in the market. The first is government restrictions on entry. So the first way that the government does this in the United States is patents and copyrights. So this type of intellectual property that prevents someone else from using or from creating the products that you're selling. Gives you the exclusive use to them for a certain amount of time. So for patents, you have the exclusive right to produce that product for 20 years from the date the patent is filed with the government. You are then a monopoly. You're the only one that can sell this. So you have this monopoly power. Copyrights are the same basic thing. They provide the exclusive right for the sale of creative works, so things like books, movies, like that. The purpose of patents and copyrights, which were written into the Constitution, so this comes very beginning of our country, is to encourage innovation and creativity. They know that if people don't have the ability to make money off of their creation, they're going to spend less time trying to create new things. So it's a way to reward them, to encourage them, but there's still limits on them, like 20 years for patents. So eventually it will become cheaper. So you earn a higher profit in the short run, help encourage you, to make up for all the research and development it's going to take to create some of these new products, like pharmaceutical drugs. It costs a lot of money to produce them or to come up with them. But eventually it allows competition, so consumers can get lower prices. Copyrights, I forget the exact law. I think it's like 70 years after the death of the author. Does anyone know? think that's right. So you can find some old books online for free in just like PDF form that you don't have to pay for. Legally, you can do that. So if you want to read old stuff, you can do that. But newer stuff is going to be covered under copyright. So legally, you'll have to go and buy it or borrow from a friend. There's another way. Yeah. In the past that we saw, and what we see in other countries sometimes, where the government takes action to block entry. So they just say you're not allowed to compete. A little bit different than a public franchise. So like the British did this with like the British East India Company, where they like, I don't know, asked the king for a monopoly for like trade in a certain area, and the king would grant it to them. You were not legally allowed to trade goods, to ship goods to that area or bring it from that area on the market. Only the British East India Company could. We see something kind of similar with public franchises in the US. So the government says that a certain firm is the only legal provider of good or service. These public franchises aren't, unlike the old school British method, like the British East India Company, where they were still a private company. For public franchises, they have a lot of oversight from the government in the US. So there's electricity, water markets. We end up with public franchises where only one firm is providing these. Another example is the post office. I'm sure none of you guys watch Seinfeld, but the picture of Newman from Seinfeld, who is the really lazy mailman who was like Jerry's nemesis. In this case, these public enterprises are being operated by the U.S. government. So the United States Postal Service is, part of the U.S. government. Interestingly enough, Herbert Spencer, he was I don't even know what to call him, kind of like a historian back in like the late 1800s. He was a hardcore anarchist that believed the U.S. government or U.S. Constitution should be null and void by the 1880s because no one was alive when it was signed at that point in the U.S. He hated the Postal Service because the government had control of this. They were the only one that could mail first-class letters. So in New York City, he started his own competing postal service, charged like an eighth of the price of the Postal Service, delivered the letters faster, and sent letters to various government offices from like the city of New York all the way up to like the federal government, saying, hey, I'm operating an illegal postal service, please come arrest me. Because he wanted to make a big court case about it. I used to get a lot of publicity to show people like how bad the post office was at the time. And we make fun of like Newman and the Postal Service now, but like it was really bad, especially in New York City at that point. He eventually was shut down, and but the Postal Service responded to that competition and lowered their prices. Was a little bit better for a while. Another barrier to entry is control of a key resource. So Alcoa, the aluminum company, for a long time, they either owned or had an exclusive contract to pretty much the entire world's supply of bauxite. So that's basically all the aluminum, because that's one of the resources to make aluminum. Only way anyone could compete against them was to recycle old aluminum. So this control of a key resource, them being the only one that had access to bauxite, prevented other firms from entering the industry and competing against them. Another example of monopoly is the National Football League, or I guess control of a key resource. So the best football players are under contract with the NFL. There's been some other football leagues that have tried to come in and compete against them. The XFL, the Alliance of American Football, the AAF. But because the NFL has control over the best football players, very difficult for another league to come in and compete against them. I was a big DC Defenders fan in the XFL, like the one season they existed before COVID shut it down. Biggest problem with the XFL, there was like no good quarterback play. If you were a decent quarterback, even like a third string quarterback in the NFL, you made more money and you were better than an XFL quarterback. So the NFL had control of that key resource for the professional football industry. And the example of NCAA, which a textbook gives, same basic idea. They have control of the key resource, at least college athletes. Another example is the De Beers diamond monopoly. They had control of pretty much all the diamonds in the world at one point. I forget the exact number, but it was like the upper 90% of known diamonds, like in mines, that they had control of. They would restrict the supply of diamonds on the market so they can keep the prices high. And they tried to prevent people from selling old diamonds by encouraging the idea of offering like a diamond wedding ring or a diamond engagement ring. But because that people have the sentimental attachment to it, they're gonna be very unlikely to sell it, or even the family members will be unlikely to sell it after that person dies. So people are constantly looking for new diamonds instead of trying to recycle old diamonds. Over time, new diamond mines were found. So by 2000, De Beers' control of diamonds fell to like 40% of the world diamond production. So their control of a key resource eroded as firms found new deposits of diamonds, so new places where they could get diamonds from. De Beers, within the last like 10 or 15 years, introduced what they call the Forever Mark. So it's a very special mark for their diamond, so you know exactly like which one it is. I don't know, you know it's better than other diamonds, you know it's conflict-free, stuff like that, to try to set their diamonds apart from their newer competitors. Doesn't quite work as well as when they had like complete control of diamond mines, but it does give them some ability to charge a higher price. The next barrier to entry is network externalities. So basically, these are where the usefulness of a product increases with the number of people who use it. So the more of your friends that are doing something, or the more other people that are using something, the more valuable it becomes. The easiest example is a social network, so things like Facebook. If none of your friends are using Facebook, then there's very little usefulness for you. Back when Parler existed, even like a couple months ago, if none of your friends were on it, if no one interesting you wanted to follow was on it, there was no reason for you to get on there. When you had Facebook and Twitter where you can share stuff with your friends. Another example is computer operating systems. So like Windows is like 90% of computers use Windows as their operating system. There's like one from Apple, there's Linux, which has like 1% of the market. There are some other ones, but the more computers use Windows, the easier it is for people developing apps or different programs to just use the Windows operating system. They code it up to fit into the Windows instead of into Apple or into Linux or something like that. So the more people that use Windows, the more useful it is for these people creating other programs. Makes it that much simpler to actually go about creating them. And auction sites like eBay, again, if there's a ton of people on eBay, there's a lot more people who are going to be willing to bid on whatever product you're trying to sell. If there's only a couple dozen people on this auction site, then the chances of you selling something or selling it for a decent price are much lower. So the more people that are on it, the more buyers that are there looking for stuff, the more valuable an auction site's going to be. So with these network externalities, it can set off what's called a virtuous cycle. So a firm, their product can become more and more popular as more people use it. If there's one fax machine in the world, not really useful to have a fax machine. You can't communicate with anyone. But once enough firms start to get fax machines, then it becomes much more useful. You can communicate with a lot more people. Nowadays we're in, for fax machines, in a vicious cycle, so it's the opposite. More and more firms are getting rid of their fax machines. People don't have fax machines in their home. So there's fewer and fewer people you can communicate with. So it's the exact opposite. There is some concern that consumers may be locked into an inferior product. So the idea that everyone has Facebook. Facebook isn't that great, but everyone has it. So you're not going to switch to something else. You're kind of locked in to that inferior product. Whether that's the case or not depends on the industry and depends on the type of product, depends on the cost of switching or of getting, all your friends together to decide to switch to something else. If all your friends have PlayStations and you want to play online together, could be fairly easy for you guys to all decide that you're going to switch to the newest Xbox. But when you're looking at, millions and millions of people on like a social network, it'd be very difficult to try to say, hey, let's all switch to this new, better thing. The final example is a natural monopoly. Natural monopolies occur when the economies of scale that we talked about 2 chapters ago, when they're so large that one firm can be a monopolist. They can supply the entire market at a lower cost than 2 firms could, or 3 firms could, or 4 firms could. So when we have very high fixed costs, natural monopolies are likely to incur. So the classic example is electricity. If you go to, you look at like any city, they end up with 1 electricity producer. If you want to start competing against the current electric company, you're going to have to make considerable investments in infrastructure. It's going to cost a lot to build the power plants themselves and then to run literally all the wires to all the houses. Cost of that is extremely high, whereas the marginal cost for producing electricity is very low. So it's not going to make sense to enter the market. And even if you do, once you spend all this money building all this infrastructure, the original firm that you're trying to compete against can just lower their price to like the marginal cost of production and immediately put you out of business. So in these cases, you're not going to see, when there's a true natural monopoly, you won't see a firm coming in and trying to compete against them. They know the costs are too high and they know that odds are they're just going to get priced out of the market. This graph of average total cost shows how a natural monopoly occurs. So let's say there's 30 billion kilowatt hours of electricity that people in this area are going to want to use per year. So yeah, in 1 year. If you have 2 firms, let's say they split the market 50-50. So right here at 15 billion, the average total, based out the average total cost curve, that's 6 cents per kilowatt hour that they're both going to sell. Again, because they have these very high fixed costs. Fixed costs are a very large portion of the cost of producing electricity. The variable costs of hiring the labor and actually generating the electricity very low comparatively. So just one firm made produced 30 billion kilowatt hours a year. That's up here at point A on the average total cost curve, which comes out to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's going to be much cheaper for one firm to just produce it all, 2 cents cheaper per kilowatt hour, than it would be if you had 2 firms competing against each other. Because we're not doubling up the infrastructure required to produce and to sell the electricity. So because the one firm can do it cheaper, we're naturally going to see one of those 2 firms that are initially producing at 15 billion will end up increasing their production. For some reason, maybe someone decides to switch to them because they have better customer service, maybe their commercials are better, for whatever reason. At that point, that sets off for them a virtuous cycle where they can lower their price a little bit because they're producing more. At that point, more people are going to start switching over. And slowly we'll move down from point B, where they're only producing 15 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, all the way down to they're producing the 30 billion for the entire market. In this case, consumers are made better off insofar as they're getting electricity much cheaper. But there's a chance that they'll be worse off in the long run because you just have a monopolist. Anyone here like Comcast? No one ever puts their hands up when you say, do you like Comcast? No, Comcast sucks. They're a monopolist. They have no competition, so they're, in most cases. So their customer service is horrendous. they have no incentive to try to be better to their customers, for lack of a better term, because there's nowhere else you can go for cable television. So we can have some negative effects of natural monopolies, but there is this positive price effect. So we'll look at how monopolists choose price and output, and I guess we'll end here because we're running out of time today. I do want to get to the review. Because monopolists have no competitors, again, this is the exact opposite of perfect competition, they're not concerned about interactions with other firms. There's no other firms for them to be concerned about because there's no one else producing this good or service. So they're just going to try to maximize their own profit by choosing what quantity to produce, just like perfect competition. Now, unlike monopolistic or perfect competition, monopolists are going to face a downward sloping demand curve. They have this market power where they can choose the price at different places on the demand curve because the monopolist's firm demand curve is going to be the market demand curve. And obviously people are going to buy less of something if the price is higher and more of it if the price is lower. So we'll look at Comcast as the example. They're a monopolist in the local market, in most local markets for television cable. When I moved to DC, there was actually 2 other competitors for Comcast. There's Verizon Fios, and there was, I forget what it's called, but there's a local DC one. It really sucked because Comcast had the highest consumer ratings. I was like 2.3 stars out of 5. It was considerably higher than Verizon and whatever the local DC one was, which sucked because I hate Comcast so much. So let's look at Comcast as a monopolist, what their revenue is. The first 2 columns, we have subscribers per month, so the quantity of cable subscriptions they're selling, and the price. Here we see the subscriptions going up. In order to go from 1 subscription to 2 to 3, and so on, you need to lower the price. So at $60, no one's going to buy cable in this example. So if you drop it to $57, one person will be willing to subscribe to cable. If we drop the price from $42 to $39, we'll go from 6 subscribers to 7 subscribers. So this is the typical demand curve we've been working with before. We drew the market demand curve, where it's going to be downward sloping. Now, unlike perfect competition, the average revenue, marginal revenue, is going to be different. It's not just going to be the price. Because we're seeing the price drop each time we sell more subscriptions. Our total revenue is going to be the same. It's going to be the quantity times the price. And our average revenue is going to be the total revenue divided by the quantity. So that's going to be the same, the average revenue, as the price, just like we saw in perfect competition. Where the difference comes in is the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue will not be the same as the average revenue, like before. The reason we see the marginal revenue, and we look at this, at 1 unit, they're all the same, they're all 57. But when we go to the second unit, the price is $54, the marginal revenue is only $51. So the revenue they're getting from that second unit they're selling is only $51 instead of 57, so a little bit less. But going from the second to the third unit, we're going from a marginal revenue of 51 to a marginal revenue of 45. So the price we're selling for those 3 units is $51. The marginal revenue is only 45. And the reason we're seeing the marginal revenue fall each time we're selling an additional unit is because each time we're selling 1 more unit, we're lowering the price. So if we want to show that graphically, we have the demand curve downward sloping here. That's going to equal the average revenue. It's going to equal the price. Marginal revenue is going to be down here below it. It's going to start very close, and over time get less and less and less. So we'll see a bigger gap between the 2. They're both downward sloping, but our marginal revenue is always less than the price, demand, and the average revenue. When a monopolist decreases their price in order to expand how much they're selling, we're going to get 2 things going on at the same time. the first thing we're going to see is the revenue increases because they're selling more. So if we reduce it from $54 to $51, we're now selling an additional unit. So we're getting $51 more. But when we decrease the price, that's not just for that last unit. It's for every single unit before that. So we'll also have revenue fall because the price reduction on the previous few units is going to mean less revenue for the firm. So we end up with a marginal revenue always below the demand curve. So going back to our table, if we're at 3 units, selling 3 units, we're selling 3 units, we're going to charge $51 in this case. All 3 of those units will be $51. If we drop the price to $48, the money we're getting, or the revenue we're getting from those first 3 units is going to fall from 51 to 48. So we're losing $3. We're making $3 less on those first 3 goods. We're now getting an additional 48 from that 4th unit that we're selling. So we're getting $3 less for those initial ones. So that's $9 total. And we're gaining $48. So $48 we're gaining from additional unit, minus the $9 we're losing from selling the first 3 units at a lower price, gives us a marginal revenue of $39. So our marginal revenue is going to be the revenue we're getting from that additional unit that we're selling, minus the lower price we're selling the previous units at. And that's why it's going to be below the demand curve, the average revenue curve. Next chapter, we're going to work with monopolistic competition, where there are a bunch of firms competing, but they have some sort of market power because products are a little different from each firm. We're going to have the same sort of demand curve here, where we have the demand curve sloping downward and the marginal revenue curve below that. So a monopolist is going to maximize their profit by producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, just like in perfect competition. The graph is different, but where we want to produce marginal revenue curve here, marginal cost curve, and again, it's that kind of Nike swoosh, kind of U shape that we saw in perfect competition. Where those 2 curves cross here at point A, that's the quantity they're going to produce at. In this case, it's 6. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, that would be the price they would sell at, where the marginal revenue equal the marginal cost, because the marginal revenue curve was the demand curve. In this case, the demand curve is above the marginal revenue curve. The demand curve is up here. So that's what consumers are willing and able to pay. So at 6 units, marginal revenue they're getting is $27 from that last unit they're selling. But consumers, for that profit maximizing quantity at 6, are willing to pay, trace up to the demand curve, $42. They're willing to pay more at that level of production. So monopolists are going to charge that higher price. Even though marginal revenue equals marginal cost is where monopolists are going to maximize their profits, that's where they're going to choose to produce, just like before, they're going to be charging a higher price. They're going to choose their pricing based off of where that profit maximizing quantity hits the demand curve. So when you're trying to draw this for the review, for the exam, you have the demand curve up here and the marginal revenue curve below the demand curve. Your marginal revenue, marginal cost is still where monopolists are going to choose to produce, and that determines the quantity, not the price like before, just the quantity. To determine what price you want to sell at, you want to trace up that quantity all the way up to the demand curve, because that's what consumers are willing to pay. The thing I want you to take away from this is that monopolists are going to charge a higher price than you would see with a firm in a perfectly competitive market. Continuing with this example, with the same monopolists, like supply and demand curve here, we can look at the profit if we include the average total cost curve. The difference between the price that the firm, in this case the monopolist, is selling at, and the average total cost at that level of production, times the quantity is going to be our profit, just like before. So it's the same sort of rectangle, the box that we had before. A monopolist is going to be earning a profit because, like, they would just shut down if they weren't earning a profit. There's no firms to leave the industry like we saw in perfect competition. And they're earning a profit here. There's no way, because of barriers to entry, that firms are going to enter and start competing against them. So this profit they had, or they had here, that in perfect competition would get competed away, is going to persist anytime there's a monopoly. Because there's these barriers to entry, and we don't have additional firms entering the market, this supply and demand curve, these cost curves for a monopolist, for the short run, is also going to be for the long run. No one else can compete against them, so there's nothing competing away their profits. So they're going to persist in the long run. So we're going to expect monopolists to continue to earn these profits. Okay, real quickly, I'll just show how monopolies reduce economic efficiency. In pop culture, or like just like in general, people don't like monopolies. So I think the idea that monopolists reduce economic efficiency is pretty well known and understood, but just to briefly show what's going on, using the idea of producer and consumer surplus. Here we have a demand curve and a very simple marginal cost curve. It's like a market supply curve. They're the same. In a perfectly competitive market, this is what we see, supply and demand. So our production is going to be here at QC, and those two cross each other. And that's the price, the PC, the price they're going to sell at. When we have a monopolist, they have a marginal revenue curve down here. The demand curve that a monopolist faces is the market demand curve, because they're the only one producing this market. So the quantity that a monopolist is going to produce at determine where marginal revenue is marginal cost. So right here, and trace that quantity up to the market demand curve. The price they're going to sell it is up here. So we have a higher price that a monopolist is selling than a firm in a perfectly competitive market. We also have a lower quantity being bought and sold in this market. So this rectangle A right here, this was consumer surplus in the perfectly competitive market. Anything above this price, perfectly competitive market, consumer surplus, all this producer surplus, remember? This is going from consumers to producers. So they're making themselves better off. But consumers are losing this, so they're being made worse off. And there's less other product being bought and sold in the market. So we have this deadweight loss, B and C here, from the transactions that would have taken place in a competitive market that are not taking place in this monopoly. Again, intuitively, most people understand that monopolies are not as good as when we have competition. This is just a graphical representation showing what happens. Monopolies are made better off, consumers are made worse off, and there's these transactions that don't take place. Then we wonder how large are these efficiency losses due to monopoly. I can't find the name written down here. Really good economists looked at this, found that less than 1% of total production in the US is lost due to the less efficiency of monopolists. So even though it looks like there's a lot of big companies with a lot of market power, turns out you end up losing $500 per person annually from this extra market power. So monopolies aren't that big of a deal in the US. There's some arguments in favor of market power that firms trying to get this market power is what causes them to, try to innovate. But there's some debate about that. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about monopolies and competition, because that's what's going on there. Normally I talk about antitrust laws and how terrible they are, but we don't have enough time for you guys to listen to a rant about that. So with that, we'll end the monopoly section there, and I'll open it up to questions for the review. One of the essay questions is about problems with antitrust policy. Since I didn't talk about it today, that's not going to be on the exam. I'll replace it with something else that is related to one of the other questions on here, so that you will still be answering it when you're looking at the study guide before the exam. So it won't be totally new. It'll be a subject that's covered on here, so that way I'm not putting something on there that you don't know about. Because again, that'd be kind of a dick move right before the exam. All right, do you guys have any questions, any of these specifically that you would like me to go over? The exam is going to be on chapter 11, 12, and 15. So it'll be the cost curves, then perfect competition, then monopoly. Monopoly will be the smallest portion of this exam because we just went over it today, and we kind of flew through it to try to get everything in on time. For monopolies, you will have to do a graph showing a monopolist where they maximize profit. So what I want you to show is this right here, like just that basic graph that they're working with. You can draw in an average total, skipped over. You can do like this one right here and show the profit and the average total cost curve if you like, but you don't have to. What I'm going to be looking for is the panel on the left. I want you to show me that they're going to produce where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, those two curves cross, but they're going to price up here above it. Yeah.
You roll the number 9.
Relationship between the marginal product of labor and the marginal cost. All right, I'm just going to pull up that PowerPoint. Okay, so the marginal product of labor is going to initially increase. So as you go from 1 worker to 2 workers, we're getting more productive. And then over time, as you add more workers to that fixed amount of capital, you're going to see their marginal product of labor decline. Marginal cost is basically going to be the opposite of that. So it initially falls as those workers become more productive. Then as you add the more workers and become less and less productive, it's going to increase. I don't have one of just marginal cost, and I didn't bring a marker today. So here we have the marginal cost curve, slowly, initially decreasing and then increasing sharply. So these, basically they have the opposite relationship. Because we're paying each worker the same amount of money, and each one, after that first worker, is producing less and less. So they're becoming relatively more, the cost of producing that next unit is becoming more and more expensive. Yeah.
Can you explain 19?
In the long run, a perfectly competitive market can affirm earn economic profits that persist. So in perfect competition, they're not going to persist because we have no barriers to entry or very low barriers to entry. If there's economic profit, and remember, economic profit includes opportunity cost. It's not the accounting profit that you see on a financial statement. I keep harping on like that fact because the first time I taught this class, I like kind of just glossed over that, and people didn't get it because I didn't mention it. So I try to mention it a lot now. If there's economic profit, firms can earn more money in that industry than they can producing in other industries. So if they see this economic profit persisting, they're going to jump in, begin competing, and as they increase the supply, that's going to push down the equilibrium price. So it's going to push down the price that they can charge. So as more firms enter the industry, pushing the supply curve to the right, so reducing the price that people are paying. For each firm, that's going to push a horizontal demand curve, margin revenue curve, straight down. And it's going to go all the way until we reach that average total cost curve at the minimum point where it crosses the marginal cost curve. So there's no economic profit being earned. Firms can still earn a profit from an accounting sense. So their financial statements can look good, they show a profit. But the opportunity costs they're facing push the economic profit down to zero. At that point, there's no more encouragement to enter the industry, and there's nothing discouraging firms or like causing them to leave. You guys can't tell when I made this like last year. I was really lazy, and I have several numbers at the end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a decent chance that those are going to be the short answer questions at the end. The short answer questions will be based off those. Little hint.
Except for the antitrust policy one.
Yeah, except for antitrust. I'll be getting rid of that and give you a question about something else that is already on the study guide. I might start off the first class after the exam real quickly bitching about antitrust stuff. Yeah, so definitely know what the 4 barriers are that give firms monopoly power. Yeah, not a ton of questions about monopoly. Again, there's not that much to talk about for monopolies, as long as you understand that they reduce economic efficiency, they charge higher prices than firms in a competitive market, and they end up selling less. So it's less efficient and makes people worse off than if it was a perfectly competitive market, or even a monopolistically competitive market. Yeah, know about sunk costs, be able to give an example, and know in perfect competition when a firm is going to shut down production. A lot of this stuff is fairly intuitive. The shutdown production is a little tricky. There's a few more things you have to remember. Remember, we're ignoring the fixed cost, and if the price is less than the average total cost, or the average variable cost, excuse me. See, I'm even messing it up. The price is less than the average variable cost, then the firm is going to be losing money even if they produce. So they're not going to produce. They'll shut down in the short run. If it's greater than the average variable cost, they can sell those products, and they can minimize their loss somewhere. So they can, some of that extra money they're making above the average variable cost, they can put towards paying their fixed cost. Any other questions before you guys take off? All right.